You're listening to The Hidden Chasm, where we explore unforeseen growth challenges that surprise SaaS enterprise. The Hidden Chasm is brought to you by United FX Inc. in partnership with Blue Nilla LLC. For more information on either, visit unitedfx.com or bluenilla.com, respectively.
The
Doing it
Love
again, Josh?
Boat, the Hidden Chasm. No, I'm not. Oh, are you recording, you jerk?
Oh yeah, we're live. So as you heard, welcome back to The Hidden Chasm. We'll have to get that
No, we're
on
not.
every episode there. Thanks,
Definitely not.
Josh. Well, welcome back, everybody who's listening. We're continuing our conversation of talking about the consequences of legacy solutions and tech debt and strategic gaps and what happens when growing enterprises run into these things unexpectedly. We've gotten to talk about that from a lot of different perspectives, from product and technology, M&A, people and culture, sales. And today we're going to be chatting about it from an organizational and transformational design perspective, which I'm pretty excited about. And to that end, welcome Mark Hill. We're excited to have you here. Mark, I'm going to read this, I always do, is an accomplished transformation and organizational design leader who specializes in guiding organizations to adaptively design their actions for mission-driven success and extraordinary results. Welcome, Mark.
Hey, thank you. It's good to be here.
It's good to have you. I guess, maybe a good place to start is just tell us a little bit about yourself and how you got into transformational design and maybe what that means.
Yeah, sure. So I think anytime you create something from nothing, like a company or a new team, you basically have to decide how is that thing going to structure and function, both from an outside perspective, if you're going to kind of look and say, how's it going to structure in a larger business economy? And then, on a micro level, you got to say, how's it going to structure, maybe if it's like a team, within a larger organization? Because none of these companies or teams, rely on themselves to feed themselves, right? They all have to get energy from somewhere, either from the economy or, from internal groups they have to work with, right? So those are a lot of really complex dynamics at play. And that's kind of essentially what organizational design is. It's like, how can we design the most frictionless entity that can basically, both, kind of enter the market, that are be high impact, and then internally, as it functions within itself, essentially be high performing. And so those are the two, I guess, dynamics you could say that I look at most of all: how companies are performing externally in relation to their goals, sometimes their peers, if I have enough time to do that kind of research, and then but also like internally with how are they really working with themselves. And,
Yeah.
a lot of times I tell I tell executives that I work with, I say, look, they say, well, how do we know if we're really doing well? Or a version of that question, right? So they kind of like want to know like what shtick I'm going to kind of help them with, like how are you going to do your discovery? What are you going to look at? All this sorts of like technical stuff. And I said, hey, I'm going to do pretty much one thing.
Mm-hmm.
And they're like, oh yeah, highly skeptical, one thing, right? You're going to kind of get there. And it is a little bit of a shtick, but it's 100% true. I said, I'm going to look at the inside of your company outside in, and I'm going to pretend like I'm a customer and I'm going to see if I'm satisfied.
Right.
Or what you're like on the inside, what you're actually like on the outside. And I said continuity between those two things counts for a lot. That's a frictionless organization that's probably extremely high performing. And we can look at org design, KPIs, all the rest of the stuff that goes into sort of making that real. But that's pretty much that's the big play on the board.
And how did you fall into this, or did you set out to do this kind of consultative work? Tell us a little bit about your career progression.
Absolutely, Bo. So I guess the easiest way to explain it without boring everybody who's listening to tears, including you two, is to say I chase problems. I started off like a lot of people do as some sort of, individual contributor role, like rolling a wheelbarrow back and forth up and down the hallway. And my wheelbarrow was project management, hanging out with the technologists. Often I tell people I'm a technology minded business person because I know enough to be dangerous and very dangerous sometimes. But um, so I will roll that thing up and down the hallway, and you take enough passes inside of organizations and you get enough reps, kind of like going to the gym.
Mm-hmm.
You get stronger. And so I just started looking at, deeper and deeper problems or bigger and bigger gaps, or to use y'all's terminology, larger and larger chasms, because some of these things are, like you say, they are truly hidden. You know,
Yeah.
the amount of executives that can look and say, hey, you know what? The reason we can't function is we've got a design flaw is maybe like 1%, really. And they had to come up through a very specialized discipline, within the wheelbarrow structure to be able to get that, right? They'll have a consulting background or something like this where they've had to go in and do operating model transformation or design stuff. So that's really how I did it. I started looking for, what's the bigger and bigger problem, or what's the 80/20 of everything that's kind of going on here. And
I really appreciated our conversations when we had worked together. Um, was very impressed by a lot of your past experience working with huge companies at an executive level internationally,
Mhm.
and the patterns that you were able to see. I know I recall some of our conversations where we had spoken about organizations that scale to a certain point, that the fractures start
Mhm.
to appear by nature of that scaling, and them not being prepared for it operationally. It was very insightful. I think
Mhm.
in many respects it led and built towards where we are here with the podcast. That kind of insight that you had.
Yeah, Josh, I appreciate that. I remember those conversations. I remember those conversations really well too. They were one of the brighter spots of that particular stop on the career railroad. But yeah, I mean, it is one of those things. It's sort of like, it's what y'all really talk about all the time, and you're right to do it and you're right to push it. And I'm going to say this about you both is that, I think what you're trying to do and what I'm trying to do aren't very different. We just
Yeah.
maybe have slightly different approaches or angles on it, which I find fascinating because this is such a big problem. A lot of angles are definitely warranted. And I think the fact that you're going after, and this is the thing we just called out, and I'm just going to kind of take what Josh said and kind of reiterate it a little bit, is that this is a truly unseen problem.
Right.
Like, your structure is outmoded for your level of competition. Like, it can be true, when we think about architecture, like, not to get too geeky and technical too fast or whatever, but like when we think about architecture, there's several levels of architecture inside of a company, right? And there's a lot of different ways to define this, but if we're really basic and really simple about it, you've got a business architecture. That's kind of how your business is ultimately designed to be able to function and kind of compete out in the market. Like, old school talk would have been like, that's your business model. Yeah, sort of like, it kind of is that thing. Then underneath that, you have how you actually produce value. And that's really your operating model, and that's where most companies transform and try to do something. But the problem is that the business architecture, sort of how that competition, or what's your future state of how you're going to be grow to sort of compete, and all the other pieces that go into the big boxes of how you draw products and lines and all that stuff, and everything in the operating model goes underneath it, and then your technical designs kind of go underneath that because they've ultimately got to support that. So when your top layer is off, like
Hmm.
truly off, all the other pieces underneath that make your company function, your operating model, your technical, your operating architecture, your technical architecture, right, and your workforce architecture, which nobody ever includes in the diagrams because I think they've had a stroke or something, but because it would be one of the most important pieces underneath that. That's the one that sort of activates all of these different models, but they're just sort of like, layers in a cake, and they have to be really well balanced and plugged in. Otherwise, you've got the world's ugliest, most lopsided birthday cake, that sort of slides off the platter and becomes food for the dogs. And that's what happens sometimes when companies don't figure out how to kind of grow their structure in terms of what their sort of competitive desires.
I,
It's a
I,
balancing act.
and I really like. I was going to ask for you to define the hidden chasm in your own words, and I think you just did. You're describing what we've been talking about, but you're describing it in a way that I don't think Josh and I really have yet, which is interesting. And I think what you said was, when your operating structure is not at the right level is not correct for the level of competition that you're at,
Mm-hmm.
and that is so apt. I mean, one of the triggers, one of the catalysts that Josh and I have tracked in terms of when does this basically punch you in the face is exactly that: new competition coming into the market and eating up your users because they can do it cheaper and better. And it's not really commoditizing, but it's on its way to that in some ways, and it's because you're just not set up for that. So I really like that. You've consulted in a lot of different companies over the years, I'm
Mm-hmm.
sure. And how often do you see run into the chasm. I feel like, especially in your line of work, it's probably all the time, but how often are you seeing it, or seeing it coming like down the road, and realize that they haven't seen it, So for example, maybe they brought you into one thing and you're sort of looking around and going, hey, there's some problems here that you maybe aren't aware of.
Yeah, that's a good question. So you're right. My I feel like the ends of my fingers are trembling because they're worn out from holding on to the ends of the ends of clips. Because I feel like, you're not really doing a good job if you're a consultant and you're really not scaling the outside where things get really hairy, because that's where all the things hide in the dark that are actually causing all the things to happen in the light. So a lot of that is pretty much all the time. But I think that's one of the more interesting. I mean, that's a really interesting question, and I've thought about this for years. I would say largely unsuccessfully, in fits and spurts. And I even tried to do this once with a large Fortune 100 company that's in the retail, but more of a more of a they're in the retail space, but they're more of a marketing company. You might guess who that might be. But some of the stuff like that, because it's sort of like early detection for when you're outgrowing your clothes, right?
Mhm.
So it's like I'm kind of outgrowing what I'm already doing. How do I really know? And I think that's one of the really interesting pieces, because as you like you all do and I do, you sit around and you start to see markers, right? You can go in and you can read a company very specifically. You just ask for a couple of measures. I don't want to see all your dashboards, because you're probably looking at too much stuff and it doesn't make a whole lot of sense. It doesn't really tell a story. So you kind of go in and you look for the stories inside of the company. You pull together a series of KPIs on different things that they may or may not be tracking, and those gaps tell you a lot. That's one piece, right? It's like, how's your revenue margin and customer retention working out for you? It's like, you go and you poke like very obvious sort of areas, and you see where there are kind of like, giant holes. And then you look and you go look at a different layer. And that's why I talked about the layers inside of the different architecture. Then you go back and you start poking around and you say, oh, that's really interesting. So you're having a customer retention problem. Is that related to pricing? Is that related to customer service? Is that related to, is it a feature issue? Is a feature parity issue or a feature superiority issue? And you go back down, and then eventually you can look at that operational layer of, how are all these things actually functioning, against the market and internally themselves. And then the third layer that you go down and you kind of look at, I'm sorry if I'm kind of geeking out on this again too, is that the third layer is really, you go back and you look at the performance of the workforce, your workforce model, because you find out, hey, you know what? We're not doing great at customer service, but we've got way too many calls, too high call handle volume for the amount of people that we have. And then we
Mhm.
go back and we find the retention rate is like worse than industry average. So like, what do you think is going to happen if it's not easy for your customers to actually use your product, or the way they're trying to use it doesn't really work? Like, these layers all connect, right? So kind of getting that part of it is really, really important, because if you can get that established, and this is one of the most important things you can kind of transform once you get some of that big structure stuff right. If you can get the right telltale signs in the right form to be able to tell really obvious stories into the hands of executives, that gap that I said, that 99% gap where people don't understand the design portion of it, you've basically sort of handed them a playbook to then be able to go back and say, oh, I see. There's a direct relationship between these things. I never looked at that on my dashboard before, right? So
Yeah.
it's really finding ways when you get in and you look at, and companies say, hey, go solve this problem for me. Go fix my operating model. We can't get value out the door fast enough. And you come back in and you say, well, you can't retain it fast enough either, right? There's other pieces to this, And until you got gray hair, kind of like you and me and Josh, I think he dyes his, but you know, I don't really know people, so don't take that as gospel. So, but anyway, until you actually have that experience or that system, which I think is what we're both trying to develop, you know, you really can't tell head for tails, right? You just kind of go in and you follow stovepipes around and bang around and hopefully fix a few things.
Yeah.
But if you really want to, as a mission, you really want to teach people how to look at their design and where it's faulty and where they really need to scale it up. You need to teach that structure, and you need to teach a lot of those metrics. And I think that's kind of the essence of what might be an early detection system, that we can
Right.
kind of leave behind with folks.
And I think one of the things I try to reinforce, when I'm speaking to executives like this, it's this isn't something I can come in and fix for you in 6 months. Maybe you disagree, but I feel like it's more about recognizing that this is going to be a journey, but let's at least help you see the big picture. and being realistic about that. I mean, from your perspective, do you think, like, how do you set align expectations around this? Because they're going to want, like, hey, can you just fix this for me? And fix it can mean a couple different things in this context, I think.
I always try to be really honest when I first start working with a group, or especially with executives, because they're used to kind of often being sort of lone wolves, right?
Right.
Because power accumulation is one of the point of most modern enterprises, right? At least from an individual basis. So you have to kind of figure out how to counter that all too human impulse, and or at least put it at ease, with you, so you can actually, land on something that's worthwhile, not only with them, but also with their peers. But one of the first things I always try to do is establish a baseline. And I think this baseline is really always a couple of promises I usually like to make on my side. The first one is, I will never do anything that's not within your own best interest long term. And if you disagree, push back. You know, kind of giving them permission to be able to push back on that, and also know that maybe I've got a longer view, and if you truly trust me, you'll probably listen to what I have to say. It kind of sort of outside ends it a little bit to kind of create a little bit of different perspective than me being, because some executives really don't know how to work with a true consultant like you guys, because they're just so used to just working with direct reports and fighting their neighbor, so that baseline's important. One of the other things I often promise them as well, or I ask them, here's usually the second question I ask. And I said, I've done this a lot. I've been to the gym, 100 times doing the same type of transformation or whatever. I'm exaggerating, of course, but how many times have you been to the gym?
Mm-hmm.
And they're like, maybe I've done this like once or twice, or, a buddy of mine in XYZ Enterprise has done, this, and we've talked about it over cigars at the fire pit, or, whatever else that is, right? Type of deal. And so you find out the sort of rep number, hopefully they'll come clean with you, and then you come back and you say, well, look, I've done it 100 times. So do you want to learn to think about this like I think about it, or do you just want to cover up or take care of the existing potholes without
Right.
understanding why the potholes happen? And so anyway, sorry, it took me a while to get to your point. I was kind of like running my talk track in my head, but like, that's really it. It's like, hey, do you really trust me to have your long-term interest in mind? And B, what do you want? Do you want to think, like your personal trainer, or do you want to think like yourself lifting weights?
Mm-hmm.
It's two different perspectives. And if you can get a yes to both questions, you've probably got somebody who's going to be, enthusiastic and honest and straightforward. You're going to get good results, because then they'll be able to actually stick beyond just patching the turnpike, which we know doesn't work at all, because it's like a monster, it eats itself.
Reminds me of there's a documentary called Escape Fire, where it's about the healthcare industry, and there's a scene where a doctor goes to the patient, and the doctor pretty much explains, hey, you've got high blood pressure, your arteries are getting clogged, you're going to have a heart attack soon, or if you need to stop eating, what are you eating? And the guy goes, I eat Vienna wieners every day. Every day you eat Vienna wieners every day. And the doctor goes, maybe you think you should probably stop eating those Vienna wieners. And he goes, could you just give me the medicine? And so I can be on my way. And it's like, okay, there's like underlying root cause. And then there's just, as you mentioned, just cover the potholes. And you have an experience to tackle an area that I don't think we've addressed yet. I mean, you were right earlier on when you mentioned, different looking at it from different perspectives. Of course, Bo and I predominantly, although the Hidden Chasm podcast is to try and see it from as many perspectives as possible, we are kind of, from our own experience, understanding it from an angle of how is the legacy technology systems affected and affecting this hit of this moment where people hit this wall, this chasm. You come from a perspective, though, based on your experience, that we're always talking about, which is how do you communicate or connect this at an executive level and help executives understand what's going on, which is it's way more difficult than I had initially assumed.
I think, well, and it sounded like, yeah, I was just going to say, Mark, it sounded like, you kind of spoke to that a little bit, because correct me if I'm wrong, but it sounds like you basically just said, put it out there and say, like, look, this is reality, take it or leave it, and let them decide, because that's what they ultimately want, right? They want the ability to decide whether it's the medicine or to stop eating the wieners.
Maybe that'll be my third question that I'll start asking.
Yeah.
Like, two is not a not a great number. Three, people usually expect things in threes. You do discoveries, you give three problems. It's always three. If it's always two, people feel like they got ripped off. That's the third question. Do you want the medicine or do you want the little can full of wieners?
Yeah. They're delicious. Well, and what's funny about that, though, I mean, I think something I've come to realize is that it's a viable business strategy just to want the medicine. And that's something that you have to be cognizant of, that um, they may not want to fix it all. There may be a good business reason not to worry about that.
And that's the thing too. You bring up a really good point. Sometimes people don't really understand the problem, so they don't think the juice is worth the squeeze. I mean, they can always usually tell that there's a lot of lift to be done, right?
Right.
But they're not really sure it's really fixable, which I think you see in kind of like platform products all the time. You take your project management or product management software and stuff like this, and you look and you're like, well, it'd be really nice if it did this, and then you realize that 80% of users aren't even using like the most basic functionality
Right.
to like link work items. So people know what's actually going to be delivered, and it's like, if you can't even get there, what good is it make like having the ability to say, based on my pace, how much planning do I need to have ahead of where I am today? Like really basic stuff. And you think, well, that would be like one of the most basic things in the world to develop or do, as part of that platform and that software. But they never get there because the paying users don't even get past go. Almost.
Yeah, the catalyst that you talked to about the competition coming in fast from behind, the carpets that suddenly have to get lifted up in the organization, and people are finding out, wait, we've been investing in this whole section, we hadn't instrumented until now, and now we're finding out that it's the value we assumed it had, it wasn't there, it didn't match our expectations. And I guess you see that often.
Yeah, I think you really do. In fact, Bo, I think this kind of goes back to part of the conversation we had yesterday when we had chit chat on the phone.
Mm-hmm.
Is I find a lot of different customers. I mean, look, none of this is new, right? I think the
Right.
way of doing business has been around since, I don't know, like Cro-Magnon man became whatever the next form of man is, whatever that is, right? Somewhere along there, everybody's kind of done business the same way, and people have built systems, and they haven't, in the fundamentals, they haven't really changed that much. But what kind of is really interesting about that is we build these systems to be able to do business, and we are unable to kind of fully articulate all the required pieces. We follow these models, and we sort of follow these norms, but we have large swaths of people that are largely untrained on how to actually read them. You can't like read the model backwards. One of the things I often do, I go in and I talk to it depends on how good my rapport is, but I'll talk to somebody like a chief product officer or somebody else who's kind of has a decent overview of exactly what's happening inside of the organization. And I go back and I basically ask them, I said, okay, draw me how you operate concept to cash.
Mm-hmm.
And the amount of people that can sit down and actually draw any kind of reasonable picture of how they operate concept to cash and then add the supporting pieces in or whatever else to draw that diagram is almost like zero. So of course, like if you are not enough of a master of your terrain to be able to draw what you are and who you are when you're trying to produce value, you're going to struggle to then do kind of what you're saying, Bo, which is go back and say, hey, how do I know if there is value in an idea? Right. So if I don't really understand how I produce value very well, I'm going to probably be ultimately kind of a little bit lackadaisical or a little imaginary about how I actually produce it. Because, you go back and you talk about one of those basic business skills, you would assume that people in a product role would know how to go out and create some kind of business case or some kind of canvas and then go back out and actually test ideas with actual potential paying customers and replicate that at several different layers in a sort of journey format and be able to come back and give you a relatively solid answer that you're saying, yes, this is investable. No, it's not investable. And that, yeah, we can set a baseline and track against this and like kill this thing as fast as we can or pivot as fast as we can if this stuff doesn't really work. But because the operating model is there not to support that,
Yeah.
The idea of doing that in the business case, you see, they're like all connected, right? It's like having parts of your brain sort of disconnected. It doesn't flow. And so all the skills lack.
Yeah.
It's either kind of all of it coheres or all of it lacks in a strange way.
What's super fascinating about that example is, I mean, it brings me back. I mean, something that's very real for Josh and I is startups. And this podcast isn't really about startups, but I do think it's like what you're describing is being real and honest about product market fit, potential value, costs, and understanding that
Mm-hmm.
dynamic. These are also principles for agile, for concept to cash flow. I guess I would refer to that as like your product evaluation or feature evaluation flow, right? Like, why are you building the thing you're building?
Mm-hmm.
And it's funny because I think, so I'll speak for myself. I think, Josh, you probably feel this way, but I'll let you represent yourself. But like, I know that from my perspective, I spent most of my career in enterprise functions speaking about those things and advocating for those things. But it wasn't until I was in a startup doing the same thing that I realized how much buffer and how much ability to skew reality an enterprise provides in that context. In a startup, it's stripped
Mm-hmm.
away. You're naked in front of people, and you have to determine if, with nothing behind you, it's okay to move forward because there's value here or not. And you screw it up more often than not. And so there's a lot on the line to figure out processes and ways to make that more efficient so that you don't burn everything down while you're trying to figure it out. In an enterprise, you don't have that risk. At least not you directly as an employee.
You would hope you did, but we've been through so many companies where I would ask like product leaders or folks like, hey, why are you doing what you're doing? And they're just making decisions based on ideas and not measuring after it gets
Yeah.
to launch. And the launch's success in of itself, whether or not it actually correlates to value to customers of the business. And it's like,
Yeah.
okay, that's what we're doing here. But it's so common. So it's just like, okay.
Well, even like me, I didn't realize
Mm.
how much I would lean on that because you're the benchmark of success is allowed to be a lot lower in that environment because if it doesn't work, there's still some value you can probably mine, but it's nothing great. It's
But
nothing crazy.
this is where, like, I want your opinion on this, Mark. And sorry, my video is slowing. It's the preventative versus reactive. It's
Right.
how is the allowing of those things to persist because, as you mentioned, Mark, those models aren't in place, that it leads to the point where people are calling you on the phone, Mark, to get you in there to clean up the mess.
It's a really good point. I mean, you can't do what you don't know. And there's always a lot that people don't know. And to Bo's point, sometimes we think we know because we kind of are able to go in and provide the transformative, I won't say academic, but the sort of transformative superstructure of these things.
Mhm.
But when we feel the weight of them ourselves, we're like, okay, maybe I need to kick the ball a little faster, and there's a tension there and there's not as much margin, right? You're burning cash. Obviously, you're like, I got to get this right the first time. You can rush things. All those very human aspects kind of come out as well. But like in terms of the preventative, um, you know, again, I've been thinking about this a while too, and this term may make sense. It may not make sense. I don't know if it exists out there. I think I googled it once and found nothing. So maybe I came up with it. Maybe I didn't. Don't hold me to any of it. I'm not legally liable. You get my drift.
We'll put a copyright on it. Yeah.
Is I think 80% of a company's success is their economic decision making cycle. Period. And I say this to people and their eyes glaze over. And I think it's just because it's not an industry standard term and nobody knows how to correlate it. But when you go back and you talk about early detection, all the rest of these things, if you are making economic decisions, that means I'm targeting something, I'm aiming, and then when I actually hit it, I expect a return. I expect to hit the target. Target, aim, hit.
Mhm.
That's what I sort of expect to be able to happen. And that's what a good economic decision making cycle will help you do. It'll help you do that kind of across the enterprise, across your divisions, lines, products, whatever. It's not that complicated. People are complicated. These systems are not, but it's really having that right process, the right roles, and then ultimately the right KPIs to be able to come back and say, oh, and whether you turn them into key results, whatever, who cares, right? But like at the end of the day, to say, are we performative? Because you would expect, to Josh's point, somebody comes back and says, all right, way to fire the gun, Mark. It's like, well, the point wasn't firing the gun. Why congratulating you for firing the gun? The point was to hit the target. Did you hit the
Right.
target? I hit the neighbor's cat. Like, okay, not good. So like maybe something else should like happen. We should do we should do something else. But that doesn't happen. So it's ultimately like if you kind of go after the 80-20 of some of the problem we're talking about, and I think this is as true for the scaling, the technical architecture part of it, which is the technical backbone of of your business, or same thing inside of your operating model. It's really being able to go back and say, is your economic decision making cycle paying attention to these things?
Yeah.
Can it identify the problems that are occurring inside of these things based on KPIs and also some of it's word of mouth and whatever else? And are we getting an honest view of what those developing problems actually look like? Right? Can I see the development of them? Because I think that too is going back to an earlier point about executives, is they're so used to having something kind of thrown in front of their face, make a quick decision, run, right? It's kind of like the fast food of decision making. And they kind of get lulled into a sense of security with it, as if all they have to do is keep looking at whatever's put in front of their face, ask a couple pointed questions, point a direction, and go. But what they often are missing, especially inside of modern enterprises, and you all are working on this from a couple different angles, I work on it too, is can you see the chasm open?
Right.
Like, can you, like, at some point it was like this, right? It was, you kind of like hop over that thing, Um, as long as you got, two legs and willpower, you could make it, right? But eventually, it kind of does this.
Right.
And as it does that, there's a pattern to it. And you may have not been paying attention to it long, but you can always start it. You can start paying attention to it. You can start actually tracking it. You can start actually measuring it. You can start actually compiling, qualitative and quantitative data on this stuff. And you can start to see these things actually happen. And if you do them well, you can actually avert things. If you continue to ignore them, you just kind of get constantly surprised, or you decide to live with whatever kind of weird limp you've caused yourself and still pretend you're a long distance runner. I don't know. Those are kind of the two options, but it happens so you can
Yeah.
see it. We're just not built to see these things happen over time. It's part of the problem.
I like the phrase economic decision cycle. And also I haven't heard that. So you may be onto something. I do think we've seen there are KPIs and processes that seek to do something similar, which is good, right? And I know you've advocated in like weighted shortest job first is coming to mind as like something that's attempting to weigh the economics of work to create prioritization and in a very abstract sort of way, things like that. So I think those concepts are there, but what's funny about them, and maybe this is your point, is they are so abstracted and specialized to specific sectors that from an executive perspective, it's not always easy to understand that, no, something like that is what your problem is. And you need to be paying attention to that because you're really thinking in terms of very specific sort of dollar KPIs and things like that, as opposed to the abstractions. So no, I think that I agree with you. I think that's probably one of the more important things. Coming back to maybe sort of the impact of these things. I'm, if we kind of go back to the analogy of your arteries are clogging up because you eat those wieners every day. the the you know there are parts of your body that are working harder and feeling that pain more than others, and I think that's probably true in organizations that are dealing with this. And I'm curious, from your perspective, which roles would you say hurt the most or suffer the most? Because knowing that can help an executive kind of look for symptoms, right? And to start thinking about, well, how is this person doing? Because if these roles are struggling, maybe there's a broader issue I need to be paying attention to.
I look at it this way. There's a couple of different things you can do to start looking at kind of who hurts the most. The answer is always, if good informed economic decisions are not being made upstream, everybody downstream suffers. That's the easiest dynamic, right? So you can pick any entry level single contributor role, and they're contorted in some way, trying to trying to avoid the reality that nobody can name out loud or even figure out what's actually happening to them, right? Except the symptoms, right? And give you a symptomology. But usually it's from a higher level, like business decision making standpoint. There's largely sort of two options, right? Often what you'll find is inside of organizations, organizations either have a balanced long-term vision and short-term view, long-term view and short-term view, or they're often out of whack. And at a top level, I find that all the time. It's like, oh, well, we're just like short-term, or we're just racing after these features. Okay, are those
Mhm.
features competitive? Are you trying to gain new customers? Are you trying to retain existing customers? Or are you trying to open a new market with a different industry segment? Like, what are you trying to do with all this stuff? And they're like, I don't know. We're just chasing these things, right? And so that's kind of an example of something that's extremely, extremely short term. And or we're trying to develop a product and we're not sure if our customer actually has this problem, but we'd imagine it would be really interesting if they did, one of these types of deals. And and then the long term view on the other side is, it's kind of like the who are you going to be when you grow up type of question. Like when you really are at the next level of mature company, whatever you've chosen that to be, what does that really look like? What's it sort of take to get there? Obviously, the long term and the short term play off each other. So when there's an overemphasis on one versus the other, and it can be in pockets in companies too, right? You get some like super long termers in one area, and they're in a weird place in their product life cycle, and it's like, well, you shouldn't be kind of thinking that long yet. You're barely having any traction, or they're thinking super short term, and they're at their sort of competitive peak, and it's like you see these imbalances. But the thing that usually has to happen at that level, once you I always look for these imbalances kind of first, is that you
Mhm.
go in and you say what roles are missing, because that's often sometimes too, especially as companies scale and grow. It's like, hey, we started out, you guys know, it's like, you're two cool founders taking on the world, right? And it's like, well, how many hats can I wear? It's like all of them, right?
Yeah.
And so you're like, okay, what do I do with all of them? And at some point, it's like when you actually grow and you scale, it's like you sort of pass some hats around and you kind of bring in people with certain skills or whatever else. But a lot of times people are left in skills or areas, and it's like there's a missing role. Like a lot of missing roles are chief product officers, totally missing. Like the unifying vision of the organization, often missing. And then whatever like weird product structure you have underneath it is completely useless. And they're just
Mhm.
basically like project managers, right? So then sales usually takes over, right? They're the ones driving the agenda because you got to like flip those cards, right? Flip the cards, make the revenue, right? And they take over, and they're super short term view, for example,
Right.
and they have no largely long term view of markets or anything else. And they just ignore marketing because marketing has no long term allies. So they just sort of get shoved into a corner, and this happens a lot, in scaling companies, and they end up in this short term view where they're trying to accelerate sales too fast and they lose the plot in terms of kind of like what's happening in the marketing they're developing or they're competing in. And so I think this short term, long term, view balance, is really, really important. I think everything is largely set up upon that because you can have a pretty average org structure. You can have a pretty average operating model, way good concept to cash, or have economic decision making cycle. You could be okay, but like if you don't have that long short balance, even those average things are going to be insanely underperforming. So, and anybody that has to live under that, God bless them.
So one of the things I heard you say there was the consequences of a key role missing. So, like in this case, you described
Mhm.
an org structure where the CPO, the chief product officer, may be missing, and we see
Mhm.
that actually a lot. There's especially in smaller companies, you see the hybrid CTO CPO role come up quite often, which sometimes works, but more often than not means that there's a bend in one direction or the other. And I like the way you describe that because there's like a chain reaction to that structure. I'm curious what structures, what other sort of concrete structures you've seen, that being one of them, that would lend themselves to these issues. But maybe a better question. You can answer either question. You don't have to answer both. It would be, what's the ideal sort of structure? Like the key roles that really do need to be there, the competencies, to at least allow this building to go up, as opposed to sort of the becoming a three-legged stool or table.
That's a good question. So, I mean, I think it's really that it's that long term, short term balance at the end of the day. It's do you really have a vision of really where you are, what your current struggles are, and what you're trying to become when you grow up?
Mhm.
If you don't have that, and the hardest part of not having that sometimes is that the CEO and an early stage founder isn't equipped to actually come up with that idea anymore because their initial idea was the baby, and they
Yeah.
made the baby grow and then they don't really recognize it anymore. It sort of outstrips where they were thinking or their vision is. And I've bumped into a bunch of founders over time that can explain how they had to take themselves out of the equation
Sure.
sometimes, especially when VCs involved in things like that, because they can kind of see outside in. So sometimes they're really helpful partners. But I mean, I think it's really having that balance. So I think if you really don't have an equal way to be able to have your, and I'm talking really kind of the front end piece of this, because this may be a very unpopular thing to say, but I think that a lot of technologists are not good business thinkers.
Yep.
They think they're good business thinkers, but they're actually not, because they've been around business thinking, but it's mostly been budgets, and stuff like that. So, I mean, there's a lot of gap to make up there. So when I say this, I'm not out there saying, because I love technologists. They're some of the smartest people in the organization, period, and wildly under leveraged. Okay, that said, when you want to get your market balance right, you really need that CPO structure. And I mean, through the whole company, right? So then you got to make sure your design matches. So you've got your CPO, you've got if you're of scale to be able to handle this, right? Your GM, your product managers, your POs, kind of, down sort of at your team levels if you're going to adopt the whole agile thing. But you need that structure. And the most important thing is balance. At the end of the day, balance wins. You can't catch the football, you can't kick a goal, you can't hit the ball, as evidenced by the Phillies' current tear to the basement, in the National League East. Like you can't. They're doing a great job at it too. What is it with Philly sports teams and being able to collapse, in the second
Um,
half of seasons? It's like
hey,
it's become an art or
you know,
something. And I'm glad I don't live in the Philadelphia area anymore, even though I'm a huge Philly sports fan, because some people would track me down and
only Philly.
throw paint on my car or something. But anyway,
Take it easy. We
Yeah,
gotta air
only
this.
Philly. Only folks from Philly are allowed to talk bad about their team. Oh
I
yeah,
was
yeah,
born in
yeah. Okay, all
Philadelphia.
right.
Yeah,
All right.
that's on my
You
birth
get the
certificate.
pass.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's when I go to Eagles games at like in competing team stadiums. You're always
Yeah,
like the best
yeah.
trash
We're
talker just
allowed to
because you grew up
boo.
in
No one
Philadelphia.
else is
Right?
allowed to boo.
Yeah, they can try, but you've got better comebacks. But anyway, because you've been born in fire. But anyway, so the disappointment breeds perseverance. But anyway, back on track. It's the balance thing that really matters. So at the end of the day, if you can't stay balanced, you can't stay upright, you can't compete, right? And so when your balance shifts too far to the other, and that's why rarely when you talk about structure, it's like CPO, your head or chief of marketing, and your marketing and your and sales, right? That's really your true business balancers, and then those roles have to run down throughout the company to support the actual operating model itself, or the economic decision making cycle, right? More importantly, that part of your operating model, really how you ultimately kind of go concept to cash and make the type of decisions you really make. Because if those long term, short term, because they're different, right? Marketing's long, sales is short typically, and CPO is both long and short, right? They're synthesizing. So if you don't have that structure kind of running down inside of your company, at least at the front end of your economic decision making cycle, you're going to chase a lot of shadows. You're going to get really, really, really unbalanced. And I think that's the trick, is finding the right people with the right skills at that level to be able to play those two
Mm,
types of roles. And I think that's why too startups struggle too, because it's like it's hard to for one person or two people to necessarily think long and short
mhm.
at the same time.
100%.
Reminds me of something Bo and I talk about often, at least within a product development context, which is the
Mm.
calling it triad, but to say that there has to be a that kind of balance. I usually call healthy tension, to say that
Hmm.
we need to find what are the most important perspectives that can fall within the business context, but that those perspectives are there, they're working together, and they're always conveying the importance of their perspective and the impact on their perspective, whether it's here's the technical impact, or here's the cost, here's the user impact, here's the cost, here's the business impact, here's the cost. But to know when you say like at the head, some sort of CPO, some sort of no matter where, as long as each perspective is pulling on their side, within a business context, that at the end of the day, the decision that wins is the one who is receiving all of that information and able to make the choice where the incentive is on what is best for the business. That seems healthy, because when it gets out of balance, it's, oh, well, we always have to do everything in the purest, most best, delightful way for the user. And then the technology goes, okay, well, that's going to take us like 2 years. But no. But, since our tension wins, let's do that. And so, okay, well, it's going to cost the business this much. Like anytime there's an out of balance, it goes from one, it gravitates too much in one area or the other. It starts to have a long-term negative impact on the trajectory of the organization where it needs to go.
I 100% agree.
And I noticed you didn't say CTO in that. And I think I don't know if you meant to do that or not, but if you did, I would understand that, because I think technology is fundamentally in service to the business. It's not the business itself. Unless you're doing something very deep, deep tech and something brand new, typically your business isn't the tech itself. That's a vehicle to deliver the value that you've just decided the business can deliver. And so that's an important notion. There's so many a conversation I will have with enterprise architects and senior technology folks who aren't necessarily in business leadership roles, is balancing the need for a purist view of tech versus what's best for the business. We want to maximize performance. No, you don't. You want you want to optimize needed performance to achieve the result of the business. That is not the same thing, and it's very important that we know that, because one of those architectures will cost 10 million and the other one, and so those distinctions are important. And I also think, but even within like the three groupings you mentioned, sales, marketing, and product, there's an inherent notion there that we take for granted, which is those three combined, or even just the product person on their own, are doing the one thing you're calling out over and over here, which is the economic decision making. But if they're not, if they're just visionaries, that creates a whole new set of problems, because what that means is now you actually don't have the business context at all. You have the same problem that a purist technical person might have, but from a product perspective, which may as well be technical now as well, because you're just describing different things that could happen without any notion of why it should happen. And so I love this notion that fundamentally what you're describing is like whether you're talking about the roles themselves or these roles within context, it's about balance. And if you don't have that, things are going to start flying off the rail. So I think that makes a lot of sense.
You said something earlier about people being harder than the systems. The systems are easy, but the people are more complicated. I'd love to hear more about that, because I'm certain you've been brought into organizations where you realize that you're finding that the folks are struggling because they're at an inflection point where they need to learn a whole new set of skills that they don't have, and they may not know it. You may be the one to have to share that with them. I'd love to learn more about that, your journey and your experience in that space.
Yeah, no, it's definitely true. Part of the hidden chasm or chasm. What's the preferred saying on this podcast? Is it chasm or chasm? Is there a choice? Is there?
We've been saying chasm. Is chasm? I didn't know that could be pronounced that way. So either is fine. But we've been saying chasm.
Maybe I just made that up, or maybe I watched too much like BBC programming. I don't know. I spelled color wrong too. All right. So anyway, so okay, so part of the hidden chasm, right, isn't just, I think some of your other guests have mentioned this as well, watching some of the other episodes, which have been great, is I think you get to a certain point and people just don't have the skills to make the leap. They don't have the skills, or they potentially don't have the experience. And the Hollywood ending would be like little Johnny does learn to hit, and suddenly he makes it to the World Series and he's playing for the Yankees, right? But that's not always like the reality. Like the story doesn't write itself that way. Some people are kind of at their maximum level for their experience. And I think a lot of times we overemphasize skills and we underemphasize experience.
Mm-hmm.
Because people with a wide range of experiences can usually learn skills more rapidly than people that just have skills but don't actually have a lot of varied experience. And I've always looked for science to back this idea up. So, like, if it sounds scientific, it's only because I imagine it to be, and I could be mildly convincing. But like, I've never seen any. I've looked for it to sort of back that up, and I don't know if it exists. But in my experience, that's actually the case. So, what happens then when you kind of go in and you find, well, you know, somebody, has been in the role for 20 some years and has kind of like made their way up within two companies, and they've been in this one for 20 years or whatever else, something like that. And you look and you say, do you really have the experience to be able to actually take a rapidly learn this skill set?
Hmm.
Because you're like, oh, it's your natural intelligence. So they're smart enough to be able to do it. It's like, well, no, there's a lot of smart people that could do academic things relatively well. But like, can you learn this and actually process all the angles as you're learning this? Because it's almost like I'm learning to be a 5 tool baseball pitcher at the same time when I have like one pitch and I'm pitching every 4 days. And I've got to keep my contract. It's like the last year of my contract where they only gave me a 1 year tryout. It's like, it's a lot of pressure and it's hard.
Yeah.
So some people can't do that. And that's the difficult part, what nobody likes to talk about. When people talk about things like displacement, maybe they're better in a lower role and you have to kind of put somebody else into place. This is when it kind of comes back, and it's very important to have like a really strong, or develop one if they're not there. And sometimes clients won't do it. They're just like, they know where it's going to go and they just sort of like avoid the whole thing. But that's where you have to come back and actually have a real, actual, pointable workforce strategy that points back to your actual future state, that long-term roadmap you're supposed to have, like who you want to be when you kind of grow up. And it's not all features on a Gantt chart. There's ideas there too. When you look at that, that's when when those two things match up and you've got that workforce strategy in that, then you've likely already got a semblance of growth that's sort of occurring. If you don't have that magic matchup, then you probably have people that have been in and running around the same parking lot most of their lives, and they're just not going to have they're not going to have any outside the neighborhood type of experience. And that's the tough part. That's when you kind of have
Yeah.
to come in and say, what does this really look like? So part of it is like getting people to realize this anyway really quickly, is that kind of going in and saying, do you, and this sounds so, it's so boring and so basic, but it is, it's like the place to start. Like, do you really have your roles defined?
Yeah.
Like the accountabilities and the ownerships and things like that. And it's like not just the roles, and then across for teaming. Do you have the complementary aspects of your roles defined? Because that's the balancer, right? That we were kind of talking about, like across the workforce. It's like, do you have these things? And if you don't, getting them to be able to do that for certain roles in certain places can then often unlock their willingness to start looking at it on a larger scale. Because, like, oh, I get why nobody's accountable. It's because the roles aren't designed to be cross accountable. It's like, yeah, maybe that's the thing.
Yeah.
So I think getting in there and doing those types of activities from a consulting point of view can really open up the right perspective to kind of do it at large, because almost no organization I've ever run into has that from the
Yeah.
start. And you can attribute a lot of problems to just missing that alone.
I think that makes a lot of sense. You're right. And we run into this too. The executive or the team really that's been with the company for 20 years. They're amazing at what they do,
Mm-hmm.
but then injecting
Mm-hmm.
a new idea can be challenged. And what's interesting is sometimes they'll intellectually absorb it, but executing on it is a whole other thing. They know all the words, and in a conversation, you're like, "Oh yeah, yeah, you're good," and then you're like, "You didn't do any of those things." um, but yeah.
True.
So I guess what one last question here is: what would you say to a CEO who suspects they're running blind into this kind of stuff? Like, what are practical, what's some practical advice you might give somebody like that?
So I think CEOs are generally really smart, highly motivated individuals, and they can't do it all, and they don't know it all, even though they have to kind of pretend they can and think they do, like a lot of the times, right? It's an extremely challenging role to be in. A lot of people sort of take it for granted and sort of like think it's like a really cushy place, but like you just haven't been around enough to know it's probably the most uncomfortable seat in the entire building, right? Which is why they get paid what they do. But so when you usually, in my experience, when they think that something's wrong, they're usually able to put their finger on it. But what they usually can't do is they can't diagnose it. You know, they've been too close to it for too long. They've been formative in making it actually happen, right? So the first thing that I think it's really important is if you haven't gotten this far because you're not smart, Most CEOs I know are analytical, but they're also highly intuitive. It's usually a match. And so if you think it's happening, it probably is. If you're not sure that you don't understand what it is, call somebody to come take a look, because that's when you want to go in, because going down and trying to get the honest answer from your position is going to be almost impossible, right? People are going to kind of tell you what you want to hear. There's going to be all these silos, all these stovepipes of conversation. You're going to be very used to hearing what you hear back. A lot of it's probably not going to be super truthful, because nobody knows how to kind of tell the truth about the things they already don't know how to do. It's not their fault. They just don't know how to do it, right? So they don't have that perspective. So, I mean, that's really kind of when you have to call somebody to come in and analyze it for you and sort of break down the problem from a third party perspective. Some people call it, whether that's looking at your strategy and adopting like kind of red teaming concepts, or that's coming in and saying, I don't think my organizational, I don't think we're certainly not hitting stuff on time, on budget, things like that. Or when things land, I'm never sure what we actually get at the end. Did we hit the target? Did we not hit the target? You'll see these things. They're going to be completely obvious for the most part. Just trust your intuition, and then call somebody in that can basically sort of diagnose it, basically front end to back end, and then set you up with some options. It's also easier for you that way too, not basically, water carrying for our industry here.
Yeah.
But what that helps you do too is it sort of separates the action and your relationships from what you actually do next too, right? It gives you that sort of the fourth leg of the problem, right? So your table actually stands up. It's like, well, is an industry expected opinion, so on and so forth, right? So you can kind of get that too. But to be able to do that, that's what I would really say.
Well, that's a good segue. How would a CEO or anybody who's joined us here and is listening get a hold of you? And what would you like everybody to know about?
Yeah, I mean, if I was maybe a little bit more diligent, I'd have a website or something. But unfortunately, I don't. Anyway, I call myself out on that. If you can't be honest with yourself, who can you be honest with? So, but you can always find me on LinkedIn. You can go find Mark Hill on LinkedIn, and you can certainly message me. And I think that's probably the best way to reach out if you want to talk, chat about what's going on.
Any cool projects coming up?
Yeah, a couple of different things. I have challenged myself. A lot of what we talked about today, economic decision making cycle, which is like the 80/20 of your operating model. The most important part, the different layers of the org design. I see consultants fumbling through this stuff all the time. And it's like they'll know like 30%, 20%, 15%, and then throw a Hail Mary and hope that that connects, right? And so there's a lot of people out there doing really honest work, but like really can't sort of connect all the pieces. So I've challenged myself over the next, maybe 2 years is too long. Maybe I'm a weak goal setter, but over the next 2 years to write a book, to basically go back and take all of this and say, how does all this really function? Like, how do you really think about the design of your organization end to end, and cover a lot of the topics that we sort of talked about today? Because I think it's a missing piece. I can't find any literature on it. I don't know what it
Yeah.
is, so I think it's a gap.
Well, you've been listening to, you being all of you who have joined us, to the Hidden Chasm podcast. Thank you, Mark, so much. You should reach out to Mark if you're facing some of these issues. We're just interested in chatting with him. You can find him on LinkedIn, as you said, or you can reach out through us. You can reach us at hiddenchasm.com and get in line for Mark's book.
Yeah,
I know
definitely.
I'll be in line. Sounds good. Thank you so much, Mark. We'll catch you next time.
Thank you all.
Thank you for listening to this episode of The Hidden Chasm. If you'd like to share your story, or if you have any questions, you can reach us via email at podcast@unitedeffects.com or by visiting thehiddenchasm.com.